Have you ever walked into a place you've never been, yet somehow every detail feels hauntingly familiar? The air, the walls, even the silence. It's as if you've already lived this exact moment before. That eerie chill you just felt is called déjà vu. Most of us brush it off as a glitch in the brain, but what if I told you there are real cases where déjà vu wasn't just strange? It was disturbing, terrifying, and life-changing. Tonight we dive into 4 true stories that will make you question reality itself. Déjà vu has always been one of the most perplexing experiences known to the human mind. A fleeting sensation where the present collides with an uncanny familiarity, leaving the person shaken and searching for answers. For centuries, philosophers, scientists, and ordinary people alike have tried to unravel why such moments occur, why a place never visited before feels like home, why a conversation heard for the first time resonates as though it was spoken long ago, and why certain events unfold with a chilling sense of inevitability. This phenomenon transcends cultures and history, appearing in stories from ancient civilizations to modern psychology, each trying to define whether déjà vu is a trick of the brain, a glimpse of the supernatural, or perhaps a peek through the veil of reality itself. Most individuals encounter it briefly and dismiss it as a harmless quirk. Yet when studied more closely, the experience begins to show an unsettling side. Some episodes are so vivid and relentless that they disrupt daily life, leaving those who suffer trapped in loops of familiarity that never fade, as though time itself has folded in on them. The human brain, vast and mysterious, is often blamed for these strange occurrences. Neurologists suggest that déjà vu might arise from small misfires in the brain's memory system, where signals between the hippocampus and temporal lobe overlap, tricking a person into believing they are reliving a moment. In simpler terms, the brain mistakes the present for the past, but even this scientific explanation does not fully account for the depth and emotional weight of certain cases, where déjà vu is not fleeting but becomes a constant torment. Researchers have found links to epilepsy, memory disorders, and even trauma, but the patterns remain inconsistent, leaving large gaps in understanding. What makes déjà vu particularly disturbing is not just its mystery, but the personal impact it can have on those who experience it frequently. Imagine stepping into a new town, walking down streets you are sure you have never visited, yet knowing instinctively what corner turns to a hidden alley, or which building will have a red door before even laying eyes on it. Imagine having conversations where you can predict word for word what someone is about to say, yet you have no logical explanation for how you know it. These moments go beyond curiosity. They strike at the very foundation of reality, making people question their own sanity, the flow of time, and whether their lives are caught in cycles they cannot escape. Stories of déjà vu range from unsettling to terrifying, with some individuals unable to separate the sensation from genuine memory, creating confusion so severe it disrupts their identity. To them, life feels scripted, as though destiny is no longer a choice, but a pattern already lived and endlessly repeating. These experiences blur the line between psychological anomaly and supernatural disturbance, and they form the foundation of the cases you are about to witness. Cases where déjà vu is no longer a fleeting oddity, but a chilling reality that forever alters those who endure it. He was a young university student, ambitious, full of curiosity, and like most people his age, constantly juggling studies, friendships, and the search for meaning in a chaotic world. But unlike his peers, he began to notice something peculiar about his everyday life, something that quickly grew from mild intrigue into a source of quiet terror. It started one morning when he walked into his lecture hall and felt an overwhelming certainty that he had already lived through the moment before. The way the sunlight fell across the desks, the shuffle of papers, even the professor adjusting his glasses, it all seemed uncannily familiar, as though he were replaying a scene from a film he had already watched. At first he laughed it off, blaming lack of sleep or too much caffeine. Yet when the sensation returned the following day with even greater intensity, he could no longer dismiss it. The déjà vu did not come and go in harmless flashes. Instead, it began to cling to him like a shadow. Every step across campus felt rehearsed. Every conversation with friends played out exactly as he remembered. He would hear a joke, laugh along, then instantly recall that same exchange happening before. down to the precise tone and pause between words. When he tried to explain it to others, they brushed it aside with casual reassurances, telling him it was common and harmless, but he knew in his gut that this was not ordinary. His déjà vu stretched into entire days, where each detail of his schedule unfolded with frightening familiarity. By the third week, he was convinced he was trapped in an endless loop of repetition, reliving his own life in fragments that overlapped and refused to separate. Sleep offered no relief. Dreams mirrored the days he thought he had already lived, blurring the line between reality and memory until he could not distinguish one from the other. Waking up, he would feel as if he had risen from a dream he had already dreamt the night before. The weight of this familiarity pressed down on him constantly, suffocating his sense of newness in the world. Even small, trivial moments like opening his notebook or sipping coffee from the cafeteria filled him with dread because he swore he had done them countless times before in exactly the same sequence. The repetition became unbearable, and with it grew a paranoia that he was losing his grip on reality. Doctors were eventually consulted, though reluctantly, as he feared being labeled unstable. Neurologists ran tests, suspecting temporal lobe epilepsy, but nothing conclusive emerged. His brain scans were clear. His body showed no abnormalities, yet his mind remained trapped in that unending cycle. Psychologists considered anxiety and dissociation, suggesting stress might be causing his memory to misfire, but the explanations felt inadequate when compared to the intensity of his experiences. He began to wonder if science could not explain what was happening to him, then perhaps something stranger was at play. He read about theories of alternate realities, about lives overlapping across dimensions, and though skeptical, he could not ignore the chilling possibility that he was caught between worlds, forced to relive moments that were never meant to repeat. The worst moments came when his déjà vu grew so powerful that he could predict what others would say or do before they acted. A friend would reach for a book, and he would already know which one. A lecturer would stumble on a word, and he could mouth it before it was spoken. At first, this seemed almost like a gift, but the longer it persisted, the more it felt like a curse. It stripped away his sense of freedom, making him believe that life itself was scripted, that nothing he did could alter the path ahead. He tried to resist, to say or do something different than what he thought would happen, yet the world always seemed to pull him back into the same rhythm. The inevitability of each outcome left him hollow, drained of hope, and terrified of the future. For if he had already lived through the present, then what awaited him tomorrow was something he might already know, but could never change. His friends noticed the change in him as he grew quieter, withdrawn, and unable to enjoy the spontaneity of life. Conversations felt rehearsed to him, laughter felt stale, and joy was replaced with unease. They urged him to seek more help, but he knew no doctor could give him the answers he craved. He began writing down his experiences, hoping to find a pattern or some clue, but all he uncovered was the crushing realization that his memories and his present were inseparably tangled. The sensation of déjà vu became his constant companion, a silent reminder that he was no longer living in the same reality as those around him, and that the simple act of existing had transformed into a disturbing cycle he could not break. She had always been a woman of routine, someone who found comfort in the predictability of her daily life. Yet over time that comfort became her greatest source of dread. It began one evening when she walked into her bedroom, switched on the lamp, and felt as though she had already seen the shadows cast on the walls in that exact arrangement before. The sensation passed quickly, leaving her unsettled but not alarmed, yet as the days went by, it returned with growing strength. Soon, it was no longer confined to waking hours. She began to experience it in her dreams, vivid dreams that mirrored her waking life so precisely that when she opened her eyes each morning, she felt she had already lived through the day ahead. The boundaries between sleep and reality started to dissolve, trapping her in a cycle where she could not tell which version of her life was real and which was a repeat. At first, she dismissed it as stress, believing her long hours at work were finally catching up to her. But the dreams grew darker, stretching into endless loops where she replayed the same conversations, the same movements, the same moments of silence. Each night, she dreamt of walking through her house, hearing the creak of the same floorboard, seeing the same flicker of light through the window, and feeling the same cold air brush against her skin. When she woke up, these details replayed themselves with perfect accuracy, making her believe she was stuck in a nightmare that refused to end. Unlike ordinary déjà vu, which fades within seconds, hers clung to her with suffocating intensity, spreading into every corner of her life. She confided in her family, who at first thought she was exaggerating. They told her everyone experiences déjà vu, and that it was harmless, a trick of the brain. But when she began to describe events that had not yet happened with eerie accuracy, they grew uneasy. She would tell them about conversations that were about to unfold, describing phrases and gestures in chilling detail, and minutes later, they would occur exactly as she predicted. What unsettled her most was not that she could anticipate the future, but that it felt like a nightmare she had no choice but to endure. There was no freedom in her foresight, only dread, because she knew she was not truly living but reliving. As weeks turned into months, the experience consumed her. She began avoiding social gatherings because she could not bear the weight of knowing what was about to be said and done. Her work suffered, as every meeting felt like a script she had already read, draining her of motivation. She stopped sleeping peacefully, terrified of the dreams that awaited her. Even when she forced herself to stay awake through the night, the sensation returned the moment she drifted into unconsciousness. The nightmare world she entered was identical to her waking one, so much so that she sometimes pinched herself in the middle of the day, uncertain if she was still asleep. Desperate for answers, she sought medical advice. Neurologists considered the possibility of temporal lobe epilepsy or other neurological disorders, yet no test revealed anything unusual. Psychologists suggested her experiences might stem from trauma or anxiety, but the explanations felt hollow when faced with the vividness of her reality. She was given medication meant to calm her mind, but it only dulled her senses, making her feel as though she were drifting further from the world rather than grounding herself in it. The déjà vu remained relentless, unaffected by treatments, a haunting force that clung to her no matter what she tried. It was during one particularly harrowing night that she realized the depth of her despair. She dreamt she was standing in her living room, staring at the clock as it ticked toward midnight. The sound echoed unnaturally loud, each tick matching the rhythm of her heartbeat. She awoke with a start, only to find herself in the exact same position, the clock hands frozen on the same time, the sound echoing just as in her dream. She collapsed to the floor, trembling, unable to convince herself that she was awake. From that night onward, she began to question whether she had ever been awake at all, or if her entire existence was a nightmare looping endlessly without escape. Her friends noticed her fading, her once bright personality dimming into quiet withdrawal. She avoided mirrors because every time she looked, she felt she had seen her reflection make the same movement, the same expression, countless times before. She stopped writing, stopped listening to music, stopped doing anything that once brought her joy, for all of it felt stale and repeated. The sense of entrapment weighed heavily on her, a prison without bars, where the walls were built from the unshakable familiarity of every passing moment. For her, déjà vu was not an occasional quirk of the brain but a nightmare that consumed her reality, a constant reminder that she was no longer living but endlessly reliving a life that refused to move forward. He was a man who had always prided himself on his sharp mind, a teacher who thrived on knowledge, memory, and the careful structuring of lessons for his students. For years, his life had been built on logic and order, but that order began to fracture in subtle, disturbing ways. It began with small slips that seemed harmless at first, moments where he felt that the class discussion unfolding before him had already taken place. Each student's question, each laugh, each scribble of chalk on the blackboard echoing as though they were rehearsed lines from a play he had already directed. The sensation was fleeting at first, a few seconds of familiarity quickly dismissed, but over time it became more profound, lingering in his thoughts long after the moment had passed. Soon it was not confined to the classroom. He began to feel it in the quiet of his home, at the dinner table with his wife, on his solitary walks through the park. He would lift a fork to his mouth and know with absolute certainty he had done it in the exact same way before, down to the position of the candlelight and the cadence of his wife's words. The birds in the park seemed to follow a script, their movements and songs already ingrained in his memory. At first, he tried to laugh at it, telling himself it was just fatigue, perhaps the burden of teaching for so many years. Yet the laughter died quickly as the sensations grew stronger, stretching from seconds into minutes, minutes into hours, until entire days seemed like copies of something he had already lived. His mind, once sharp, became clouded by doubt. He began to confuse whether an event had truly happened or if it was just part of the déjà vu. He would ask his students if they had already covered a topic, certain they had, only to be met with blank stares. He would remind his wife of conversations they had never had, reciting phrases word for word, convinced he was repeating something rather than imagining it. His sense of time became unstable, as though the past, present, and future were folding together in a blur that he could no longer untangle. What frightened him most was not just the familiarity, but the way it seeped into his identity, threatening to unravel the very core of who he was. Doctors became involved after his family noticed his growing distress. They ran tests suspecting the beginnings of dementia or other cognitive decline. Brain scans revealed irregular activity in the temporal lobe, but no clear answers emerged. Some specialists suggested temporal lobe epilepsy. Others argued it was an unusual psychological condition, but the man could not find comfort in either explanation. For him, the experience was not a misfiring of neurons but a lived reality. He described it as being trapped inside a loop, where life was no longer linear but spiraled endlessly, pulling him deeper into repetition he could not escape. His condition worsened when he began to feel déjà vu not only about the present, but about the future. He would predict outcomes with haunting accuracy, and when they inevitably came true, it left him more disoriented than ever. One evening, while grading papers, he paused as he felt the unmistakable wave of déjà vu crash over him again. He saw his hand moving across the page, heard the faint ticking of the clock, and felt as though he were watching himself from the outside. It struck him with terrifying clarity that this moment had no end, that he had been here before and would be here again, caught in an infinite cycle. He dropped the papers, his heart pounding, and stared at the clock as its second hand ticked forward. Each tick felt rehearsed, as though time itself was mocking him. He tried to change his actions, to stand up suddenly, to shout or break the cycle, but even those movements carried the same heavy familiarity. Nothing felt new, nothing felt free. His family grew desperate as his behavior shifted from confusion to fear. He refused to leave the house, certain that every step outside would only confirm what he already knew. He stopped reading, stopped teaching, stopped engaging with the world because every word, every gesture, every sound pressed upon him with the weight of repetition. Nights offered no relief, for his dreams were filled with the same sensations, blurring even further with his waking life. In dreams he taught the same lesson, walked the same path, sat at the same dinner table, and when he woke, those very moments unfolded before his eyes exactly as he had dreamt them. His world had become a prison of memory and familiarity, a labyrinth without exit, where time circled back upon itself endlessly, leaving him with no way to distinguish between what was lived and what was imagined. She was only in her late 20s when the first signs appeared, and unlike others who could shake off the strange familiarity of déjà vu, hers was suffocating, relentless, and unyielding. She worked in a busy city office, surrounded by noise, chatter, and the constant flow of activity. Yet even in that chaos, she began to notice patterns she could not escape. One day, while typing at her desk, she froze mid-sentence, certain she had written the exact same line in the exact same way before. The position of her coffee cup, the murmur of her coworker's voice behind her, the sound of a stapler clicking. It all fell into place like pieces of a puzzle she had already solved. At first she tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, convincing herself it was stress from deadlines and long hours, but the episodes multiplied until they overshadowed every moment of her life. The strangest part was how detailed they became. She would walk into a meeting and already know which colleague would speak first, which joke would be made, even when someone would cough or shuffle their papers. It was not vague recognition, but a precise anticipation that struck her with growing dread. When she tried to explain it, her coworkers laughed it off, telling her déjà vu was normal and nothing to worry about. Yet theirs were passing moments, while hers stretched like elastic, snapping her into a state of déjà vu, an overwhelming certainty that she was not just remembering but reliving entire experiences. The sensation left her dizzy, drained, and afraid to speak, because she already knew the words before they were spoken. Her nights became no different. Sleep, once a refuge, turned into a continuation of the cycle. She dreamt of office hallways, of phone calls, of trivial conversations, and every dream replayed itself in her waking life with terrifying precision. It was as though her mind had stopped distinguishing between dream and reality, weaving them together into one endless repetition. She began waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, whispering to herself that she had lived it all before. Yet when morning came, the cycle continued without mercy. Her family grew concerned as she became withdrawn. Meals with her parents felt rehearsed, as though she had sat at the table countless times before, watching the same fork scrape against the same plate, listening to the same questions about her health. She could no longer enjoy their company, because every smile, every sigh, every glance carried the heavy weight of repetition. Friends began to drift away when she refused invitations, unable to face social gatherings that only reinforced her torment. In her isolation, the déjà vu grew stronger, feeding off her solitude, making every hour feel like the echo of another. Desperate for answers, she visited doctors who performed test after test. Neurologists examined her brain, searching for signs of epilepsy or temporal lobe dysfunction. Psychiatrists listened patiently, suggesting anxiety or obsessive thinking. None of the explanations satisfied her, because none captured the sheer intensity of what she endured. Her condition was not a fleeting mental trick. It was her entire life unraveling into cycles. She began to keep journals, writing down everything she experienced in an attempt to anchor herself, but even the act of writing felt repetitive. Each page she filled gave her the sense she had already written it before, down to the exact phrasing of every word. At work, her performance collapsed. She avoided projects, unable to find motivation when every task felt preordained. She stopped answering calls, convinced she already knew what the person on the other end would say. Eventually, she left her job, retreating to the confines of her apartment where she felt slightly safer, though no less trapped. The walls of her home became a stage she knew too well, each creak of the floorboards and flicker of light haunting her with a sense of familiarity so strong it bordered on madness. She could not escape, because even in silence, even in stillness, déjà vu lurked, reminding her that nothing was new and nothing would ever be new again. Her mind spiraled into darker places as she began to wonder if she was trapped in a loop of existence, cursed to relive the same fragments forever. She questioned whether her memories were real or fabricated by her brain, whether time itself was broken, or if she was the one who had broken. On some days she feared she was dead, and this was a punishment, a limbo where she was doomed to repeat her life without change or resolution. On other days she clung to the hope that someone would discover the cause and free her, but no answer ever came. The sensation of déjà vu had consumed her identity, hollowing her out until all that remained was a woman uncertain. If she had ever truly lived at all, he had been a traveler most of his life. Someone who found purpose in moving from place to place, never staying still long enough to feel trapped by routine, yet no matter how far he went. The unsettling grip of déjà vu followed him like a shadow he could never outrun. It began on a train ride across Europe when he looked out the window and felt a chill at the pit of his stomach. Certain he had already seen the exact stretch of countryside rolling past, the same crooked tree standing alone in a field, the same flock of birds scattering into the sky. He dismissed it at first as coincidence, telling himself that landscapes often looked alike. But when the same sensation struck him at a station he had never visited, watching strangers move about as though they were actors repeating a play he had already watched, his confidence faltered. As his journeys continued, the episodes became more frequent, intensifying until they consumed every destination. A cafe in Paris felt identical to one he swore he had visited before, down to the chipped mug set before him and the hum of a particular song playing faintly in the background. In a crowded market in Istanbul, He felt as though he knew the vendor's words before they were spoken, the clink of coins before they hit the wooden counter, the scent of spices before they reached his nose. He began to predict moments with eerie accuracy, anticipating conversations, movements, even subtle gestures from strangers he had never met. Each time it happened, the joy of discovery that had fueled his travels dimmed a little more, replaced by an inescapable dread that nothing he encountered was truly new. The worst part was that traveling no longer freed him from the weight of repetition. He once believed new places would break the cycle, offering fresh sights and sounds, but instead the déjà vu spread its roots deeper, convincing him that even across oceans and continents, his life was already mapped out. He stopped taking photographs because every picture felt like a duplicate of one already captured. He stopped writing in his travel journals because every line he tried to compose felt like it had been written before, the ink already dried on pages he hadn't yet touched. The thrill of exploration faded into numbness, and every step became heavier with the belief that he was retracing steps he had already taken in some forgotten loop of time. He turned to doctors abroad, hoping that somewhere someone would offer answers. In Germany, a neurologist suggested his brain might be misfiring, confusing short-term memory with long-term recall. In Italy, a psychiatrist spoke of trauma hidden in his subconscious, resurfacing in the form of distorted familiarity. But none of the explanations seemed sufficient, not when the episodes were so vivid, so consuming, and so consistent. He began to wonder if he was cursed, if his wanderlust had led him not to freedom, but to a prison without walls, where every corner of the world was fated to feel recycled and stale. His friends noticed the change in him, once a man who shared stories with endless enthusiasm, now quieter, detached, reluctant to describe his travels. He no longer marveled at ancient ruins or bustling cities. Instead, he walked through them with hollow eyes, certain he had already done so countless times before. He tried to resist the sensations, to force himself to act differently than he anticipated. Yet even his attempts at spontaneity felt rehearsed, like lines he had already delivered in a role he could not escape. At night, alone in unfamiliar hotels, he would stare at the ceiling, unable to sleep as his mind replayed the same thoughts, the same fears, over and over again. Dreams mirrored his waking experiences, placing him in cities he had not yet reached, only for him to arrive days later and feel the crushing familiarity of a dream coming to life. The line between sleep and reality blurred until he could no longer tell whether he was dreaming his travels or living his dreams. Eventually, he grew afraid of moving forward, afraid that no matter where he went, the same cycle would continue. The airports, the train stations, the cobbled streets, all of them felt like sets he had already walked across, actors repeating lines in a play that never ended. He began to question not just his travels, but the nature of existence itself. Was he caught in a loop, destined to wander endlessly through the same recycled experiences? Was time broken, or was he merely broken within it? His journeys, once a celebration of freedom, became chains that bound him tighter with every passing day, and no matter how far he ran, the sense of déjà vu was always there waiting, ready to remind him that he was not escaping at all but circling endlessly through a world that refused to feel new. He had lived most of his life in a small, quiet town, a place where the streets barely changed, and where everyone knew one another. Yet it was in that very stillness that his experience of déjà vu grew into something monstrous. At first, it came in the form of brief moments, a strange flicker of familiarity when walking past the old church or stepping into the grocery store. But soon the flickers turned into long stretches of time where entire days seemed to replay themselves. He would wake up in the morning and know exactly when the kettle would whistle, when the neighbor's dog would bark, when the postman would knock at the door, and as those moments unfolded exactly as he anticipated, he felt his grip on reality slipping. Unlike others who could shake off déjà vu as a passing sensation, his episodes stretched on, making him feel like an actor trapped in a play he had no control over. Conversations with people in town became unbearable. He would greet someone on the street and already know the words they would say in return, the way they would gesture, the pauses between their sentences, even their expressions, the tilt of a smile or the narrowing of eyes. carried with them the heavy weight of repetition. The more it happened, the more he withdrew, no longer seeking company because the illusion of predictability robbed interactions of their meaning. He stopped going to community gatherings, stopped attending church, stopped visiting friends, because every moment felt like a copy of one he had already lived, draining him of the energy to pretend he was surprised by anything at all. His family became worried as his isolation deepened. He tried to explain the sensation to them, describing how days unfolded as though they were per-written, but they could not understand the intensity of his experiences. They reminded him that déjà vu was normal, that everyone felt it once in a while, but he knew theirs was fleeting while his was relentless. His siblings began to avoid the subject, treating it as an obsession he was feeding rather than a condition consuming him, but their dismissal only pushed him further into solitude. Nights became the worst, because even in sleep he could not escape. His dreams mirrored his waking life, mundane moments of walking through the kitchen or hearing the creak of the front steps replaying themselves exactly as they would the next day. He would awaken with dread, knowing he was about to live what he had already dreamt. Seeking answers, he visited doctors in the nearest city. Some ran tests, checking for neurological disorders, while others suggested stress or depression, but none of the explanations made sense to him. The doctors spoke of the brain misfiring, of memory pathways confusing the present with the past, yet these clinical words felt hollow compared to the depth of what he endured. He did not simply recognize the present as familiar. He lived it twice, once in a dream or memory and again in reality, unable to escape the cycle. He left the appointments more frustrated than relieved, knowing that science could not explain the endless loop in which he was trapped. As weeks stretched into months, he began to question time itself. He no longer trusted clocks or calendars, certain that they were meaningless in the face of the repetition he felt. He would sit for hours by the window, staring at the street, watching as cars passed in the exact sequence he remembered, convinced that he had seen them all before. The sound of footsteps on the pavement, the laughter of children playing outside, the rustle of leaves in the wind, all of it seemed rehearsed, as though the world itself was replaying. He started to wonder whether he was caught in some eternal recurrence, condemned to relive the same life again and again without progress or change. His health deteriorated as he struggled under the weight of his condition. He stopped eating regularly, stopped sleeping peacefully, stopped caring for himself, because each action seemed futile when it was nothing more than a repetition of what had already been done. Friends tried to intervene, but he pushed them away, unable to bear the thought of conversations that felt like echoes of the past. He began to write notes to himself, desperate to find some way of proving whether he was truly repeating experiences or whether his mind was betraying him. Yet each note only deepened his confusion, as he could not tell if he had written it once or many times before. Eventually, the town that had once been a source of comfort turned into a prison. Every street corner, every familiar landmark, every face he encountered carried with it the crushing weight of déjà vu. There was no escape, no relief, no possibility of newness in his life. He lived each day as if trapped in a loop, a cycle that stripped existence of its spontaneity, leaving behind only a haunting sense that time was broken and that he was cursed to endure its endless repetition without understanding why she had always been fascinated by puzzles and mysteries. Kind of person who thrived on solving crosswords, riddles, and cryptic problems, but when déjà vu began to dominate her life, it was no longer a puzzle she could enjoy unraveling, but a nightmare she could not escape. It started subtly with brief flashes of familiarity while reading a book, as though she had already turned the same page before, not just once, but countless times. She told herself it was nothing unusual, that everyone experienced déjà vu occasionally, but soon the sensation spread beyond reading and seeped into every corner of her daily existence. A conversation with a friend felt rehearsed, each laugh and pause perfectly predictable. A walk through the park carried with it the unmistakable weight of repetition, from the rustle of leaves to the cry of a distant bird. The world seemed to fold back on itself, stripping away the comfort of chance and replacing it with suffocating certainty. Unlike others who tried to dismiss the phenomenon, she could not let it go. She began to track her experiences, writing down the details of every déjà vu episode, cataloging them in notebooks she kept stacked on her desk. She searched for patterns, convinced there was an explanation hidden in the repetition. The more she recorded, the more she realized how extensive it was. Days blurred together as she discovered that not just moments but entire sequences of her life felt duplicated. She documented them obsessively, but with each entry she felt a growing dread that her journals were not simply observations but rehearsals, words she had written before in some other cycle of her life. Her obsession bled into her relationships. Friends noticed her growing detachment, the way she would pause mid-conversation, eyes narrowing as though she already knew what they were about to say. At first they laughed, treating it as a quirky habit, but soon they grew uneasy, uncomfortable with how often she would finish their sentences or predict their actions. She no longer felt joy in their company, because every interaction felt like watching a film she had already seen too many times. She began to avoid them, retreating into her apartment where she surrounded herself with notebooks and theories, desperate to solve a mystery that only grew darker the deeper she dug. Her dreams became entangled in the pattern. At night she would experience the same cycles, vivid dreams of everyday moments, boiling water, answering the phone, opening the front door, only to live them again in waking life with eerie precision. The repetition of dreams and reality merged into a single loop where she no longer trusted her perception. She tried to fight it, changing her routines, forcing herself to make different choices, but even those acts of rebellion felt rehearsed, as though she had already attempted them before. The sense of freedom she once cherished drained away, leaving her trapped in a world where nothing was spontaneous and everything was predetermined. Doctors offered no comfort. Neurologists suggested temporal lobe disturbances, while psychologists spoke of obsessive tendencies feeding the sensation. None of the explanations satisfied her because the depth of her experience could not be explained by medical jargon. It was not a glitch in her brain. It was the fabric of her life itself unraveling. She began to question whether she was experiencing time in a linear way at all. Perhaps, she wondered, she was caught in a loop, condemned to relive her life endlessly, each cycle slightly altered but always the same in essence. The thought both terrified and consumed her, driving her deeper into her search for meaning. She began experimenting with ways to break the cycle, attempting to act irrationally, to make choices that seemed unpredictable even to herself, but the results only deepened her despair. Whether she shouted in the street, left town on sudden trips, or destroyed pages of her notebooks, everything carried the same heavy weight of familiarity, as though her rebellions were themselves part of the script she could not escape. The more she struggled, the tighter the loop seemed to close around her. Her notebooks, once a source of clarity, became symbols of her entrapment. She would flip through them late at night, her hands trembling, certain she had written the same words before, not just in that cycle, but in countless others. Some entries frightened her, lines she did not remember writing yet recognized with chilling certainty, as if another version of herself had left messages across iterations of her life. She began to fear her own handwriting, seeing it as evidence that she was not experiencing time as others did but trapped in an endless spiral where she could never break free. Her apartment became a sanctuary and a prison all at once. She rarely left, convinced that the outside world offered nothing but repetition. Every sound that drifted through her window, the hum of traffic, the laughter of strangers, the bark of a distant dog, struck her as part of the endless cycle. Her life narrowed into a pattern of observation, dread, and hopelessness, a cycle she could not stop, and though she searched tirelessly for an answer, what haunted her most was the fear that there was no answer at all, only the suffocating certainty that everything had happened before and would happen again. He was a man of logic, a scientist whose career was built on evidence and data, someone who dismissed the supernatural and clung firmly to the tangible, yet even his rational mind could not shield him from the slow encroachment of déjà vu that began to erode everything he believed about reality. At first, he tried to explain it away in the same way he explained every other anomaly, chalking it up to fatigue, stress, or the mind's tendency to misfire under pressure. But the episodes grew longer and sharper, expanding from fleeting sensations into overwhelming waves that left him shaken. Sitting at his desk in the laboratory, he would suddenly know which colleague was about to enter the room, what words they would speak, even how the beaker on the counter would wobble and nearly fall before he caught it. The familiarity was too exact, too detailed, for him to ignore. He began recording the incidents in meticulous detail, convinced that careful observation would reveal the truth. His notebooks filled with descriptions of moments lived twice, predictions that came true, sequences of events unfolding exactly as he had anticipated. At first, he told himself that this was simply pattern recognition, the brain's ability to predict outcomes based on subtle cues. But as the entries piled up, he found himself unable to explain the uncanny precision. Some of the moments he documented were so specific, so impossible to anticipate, that they shook his faith in science itself. When he walked into a lecture hall and saw every student's expression, every shifting chair, every cough unfold exactly as he had already imagined, he felt a chill deeper than any experiment had ever given him. As the déjà vu deepened, it began to interfere with his work. He lost focus on research, unable to concentrate when every action felt like a repetition. Writing equations on the board, he would freeze, certain he had written them not once but countless times before. His colleagues noticed the hesitation in his lectures, the strange pauses when he stared into space, eyes distant as though he were watching time repeat itself. Some dismissed it as overwork, others whispered that he was unraveling, and though he tried to maintain his composure, inside he felt a storm building. He turned to science for answers, reading everything he could about memory, perception, and temporal lobe activity. He conducted self-experiments monitoring his sleep, tracking his diet, measuring brain activity where possible, yet the data offered no comfort. Every test ended in ambiguity, every theory seemed insufficient. The déjà vu did not behave like a random glitch. It behaved like a pattern, as if he were caught in a loop of existence repeating itself with flawless precision. The scientist in him longed to dismiss it, but the man living through it felt powerless against its grip. As days passed, the sensation stretched into nights. He dreamed of his experiments, of walking through the laboratory, of conversations with colleagues, and in the following days those same dreams unfolded with terrifying exactness. He began to dread sleep, fearing that what he dreamt was simply a rehearsal for the next day, stripping his life of spontaneity. He questioned whether he had any free will left, or whether he was merely playing a role in a cycle that had already been determined. The weight of this thought grew heavier until even small tasks like pouring a cup of coffee or opening a door filled him with dread, because he already knew how they would end. His relationships began to collapse under the strain. Friends who once admired his intellect now found him distracted and distant. Conversations became unbearable, because he often knew what others would say before they said it, and in trying to mask his awareness, he came across as detached and cold. He withdrew from gatherings, preferring solitude, though isolation only magnified the déjà vu. Alone in his home, he would pace from room to room, haunted by the certainty that he had walked those paths countless times before. The creak of the stairs, the hum of the refrigerator, even the shadows shifting across the wall, all of it felt staged, part of a script that played out endlessly. His health faltered as sleep deprivation and anxiety took hold. He began to lose weight, his hands trembling as he scribbled frantic notes trying to prove or disprove his experiences. The more he wrote, the more he felt like his notebooks were not records but repetitions, words he had already written in some other cycle of his existence. He began to find sentences that chilled him, lines that felt foreign yet familiar, as if another version of himself had written them long before. This discovery shattered what little stability he had left, convincing him that he was not the only one trapped, but one of many selves endlessly circling through the same reality. In his most private moments, he began to question the very fabric of existence. Was time linear, or was he merely moving through a loop disguised as progress? Was memory failing him, or was memory the only real thing, replaying itself over and over while he mistook it for the present? He no longer trusted his own senses, because every sight, sound, and touch carried with it the weight of inevitability. He tried to rebel, to make choices that defied the script, but even those felt rehearsed, as though his rebellion had been written long before he acted on it. With every passing day, the boundary between reality and repetition dissolved further, leaving him stranded in a world where discovery was impossible, and where every breath, every word, every step was nothing more than the echo of something already lived. The final case was the most unsettling of all, because it was not just about moments of repetition or days replaying themselves, but about an entire life swallowed by déjà vu. The man at the center of this story had lived for years under its weight, every detail of his existence repeating itself so thoroughly that he no longer knew where memory ended and the present began. Unlike others who tried to fight against it, he surrendered, convinced that resistance was useless. He stopped searching for medical explanations, stopped writing notes, stopped confiding in friends. Instead, he accepted the cycle, moving through his life as though he were a ghost drifting through scenes he had already performed. At first, that acceptance seemed to give him peace, but it soon became a different kind of torment. By surrendering, he began to feel detached from everything around him. When his family spoke to him, their voices sounded like recordings. When he walked down the street, every sound and movement struck him as part of an endless film reel. He no longer believed in chance or choice. He believed he was simply an actor in a script replaying for eternity. His eyes lost their spark, and he drifted through his days with the hollow resignation of someone who no longer expected anything new to come. But then something happened that shook even his numb acceptance. One evening, as he sat staring at the wall, overwhelmed by the familiar hum of his surroundings, he felt a sudden shift, an interruption in the loop. It was not dramatic, just a single moment that felt different, something he could not recall experiencing before. For the first time in years, he felt uncertainty, the unfamiliar tremor of unpredictability. It terrified him and yet gave him hope. If the loop could be broken, even for a second, perhaps his life was not doomed to endless repetition. That fragile spark carried him forward. He began to look more closely at his days, searching for other breaks in the cycle. And though they were rare, he found them, tiny variations, subtle changes, moments that didn't match the script. It was then he realized that maybe the prison of déjà vu was not entirely unbreakable, that perhaps it was not a curse binding him to fate, but a distortion that could be pierced if he paid close enough attention. The story closes with him standing in his backyard at dawn, watching the sunrise. The light broke across the sky in a way he swore he had never seen before, painting the world in colors that felt utterly new. For the first time in what felt like forever, he did not know what would happen next. That single moment of uncertainty was more powerful than all the cycles that had haunted him, because it meant that the future still held something unknown, something unscripted, something alive. Thank you so much for staying with me through this journey into the disturbing world of déjà vu. These stories remind us that the mind is both a mystery and a labyrinth, capable of twisting reality in ways we can barely understand. If you enjoyed this story, I truly appreciate your time, your curiosity, and your support. Stay safe, stay curious, and until next time, thank you for being part of this experience with me. Would you like me to also create 6 image prompts for this final chapter, the way I did with your previous stories?